Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship by Venture for Canada. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to help build one of the most prosperous entrepreneurial ecosystems in the world.
I am very excited to have Laura Buhler on the Venture for Canada podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. And at Venture for Canada, we care so much about community. Venture for Canada really at the core is a community. And I think that the topic of community is something that's often not explored that much as it relates to entrepreneurship. And we're really excited to have Laura Buhler on the Venture for Canada podcast today. Laura and I have known each other for close to 6 years, and she's a former board director at VFC, supported VFC in many different ways. We worked really closely together for a long time. And she currently works in community for a venture capital fund in San Francisco. Laura, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Scott.
Really excited to dive into this topic with you. And to get things started, what is community?
Well, at its core, I think that community should probably look different depending on the product and industry persona, but they all come down to the same thing, which is really about building affinity, creating an affinity group for the people you serve and helping them to add value to one another. So a lot of people think about community versus marketing as like, if marketing is about a leader with a megaphone or a brand with a megaphone out to a group of many, community is about helping create tons of conversations in the many to many, about creating a affinity group that actually gets value from one another, not just from hearing from your brand, whether that's a person or a place that they all have in common or a company. So it comes down to an affinity group that adds value to one another and back to the entity that created it.
Why do you think that community is something that is increasingly important in our modern world?
Well, that's okay. That's an interesting way of putting it. One big change, I think, is that you're seeing community as a title and a skill set. You're seeing it more and more. It's not like the new modern world is new to communities, right? Community, we are a community species. We are like wolves and dogs. We are ants. It might even be a better way of putting it. We do have a tendency as people to self-organize. But what you are seeing more and more is that this is a title and a skill set in the technology industry, in the private sector in general. And so why is that? Why are so many venture capital funds or technology like software companies creating community functions? And even at the executive level, that's what's kind of new. And so I think that in many ways, this is because we have discovered that if, I'll use a really common Silicon Valley adage here, if product is the king, community is the kingdom, that having a really vibrant community of users or customers or people with the same problem set, people experiencing the same thing in life together, you can add a ton of brand affinity, of value, to a group that you ultimately want using your product, right? So really a great example of a community business model that just went public a couple weeks ago is Reddit, right? Which is a really good example of internet communities. So I think the social media era has propelled this to some extent. But also people have just started to find real value in having thriving communities.
When you speak of Reddit, I also think of Facebook. And we're both of the generation when we were in university, Facebook was something you posted a lot. I remember even using Facebook sometimes as like a Twitter device as I cringe back to my sort of updates on things. But when you think of Facebook today and like how does Gen Z use Facebook? It's in communities. It's Facebook Marketplace.
Right.
That in that essence, like Facebook, it sort of transitioned from a social sharing to more of like a community marketplace. Like most Gen Z that I know that Facebook accounts only have it for marketplace and to be able to buy and sell things.
Wow. What I love to see is all of these new communities propping up on different platforms. So Facebook, of course, like I know there was a time when it was like MySpace, and then it was Facebook, and then it was Instagram, and you could argue that there's Twitter thread through all of that. You're mentioning marketplace. That's really cool. So in my work, I work in the technology ecosystem. Communities are built on Reddit, of course, but on GitHub, on Discord. There are new communities kind of being born every day around new software trends, around new business models, and so like they sort of crop up every time there's like a major wave or a major problem that a group has to solve. And where I've been spending a lot of time is actually in the AI ML practitioner community. I think that moments like this, when there are paradigm shifts in technology, make the need for community really strong, because what you have is a bunch of talent, most of which are really new to the field because it's a new field still in general. A lot of them are new to the workforce. Like a lot of them are very young in their careers, and they have very precise but still developing skill sets that are rare and valuable in the workforce. And if you are kind of the new like machine learning engineer from a company, like Toyota or like, Meta or whatever company it is, or Bank of America, Royal Bank of Canada, there are only so many people like you in your organization, and that need to kind of learn and exchange ideas, exchange feedback, and get to know who your people are. The collective learning is happening, and it's pretty inspiring to see, and it's happening so fast. I live in San Francisco, which is really become another hub for this new technology boom in the AI space. And I heard yesterday, I was at an AI conference yesterday, that there are 85 conferences just dedicated to AI in San Francisco in the month of April of 2024. That's like 3 per day, and those are communities, right? Those are going to be hosted by, some of which are just new communities that have sprouted up. Others are going to be centered around the university research community. Others are going to be around companies. And as new waves of technology and as new models are being released, it creates the need for people to get together and learn really quickly together. So I think that and you might want to edit my language now because I've been so verbose about this, but one of the values of community is that it accelerates people's learning. It accelerates the path to expertise in a given skill set, career problem to solve, opportunity. And so in my life, I was had the pleasure and joy of leading a global community of Canadians who are building startups and investing in them, called the C100. It's really the preeminent global community of Canadians in tech. And I always thought about this, like, how do we get people together to accelerate their network so they can build companies faster, so we can like see more success in Canadian entrepreneurship. But that's how it is with every community. I think it just really like accelerates people's ability to find those connections and build what some people call like tribal knowledge. So yeah, communities can be super powerful, super powerful.
To your point about the 85 different AI conferences, it seems like that there's probably more competition amongst communities for people's time, attention. We just have so many different options for us to spend our time.
Yeah.
So what are the, how can an AI conference, let's say in San Francisco, stand out relative to its peers so more people want to participate in it? Like, and to maybe rephrase the question, what are the defining aspects of the most valuable and most sought after communities?
Oh, this is interesting. Okay, I think this is I think a conference does not a community make. So let's just like put aside the conferences for a second. A conference is a tool, a product that helps a community thrive. And so the community is the group of people, right? And conferences can be very effective at that. I actually just went to 2 conferences this week, both of which were very, very much geared towards accelerating the learning and the career paths of the respective people in those communities. But the holy grail in community really is engagement. And so when people say, oh, it's engagement and impact. So if like we go, one of the questions I'm sure you're going to ask me is like, what KPIs do you measure? How do you know if a community is thriving? Attendance to a conference is one metric in the engagement bucket. Engagement can be measured like with basically touch points, amount of activity. Are people attending the event? Are they making referrals to other people to join the community? Those engagement metrics are really important because they're really quick, easy to measure. Like, the second an event happens, for example, how many people showed up. And so that's like an engagement point. What that doesn't give you is impact. And so impact is a little bit usually more qualitative. For example, you might have logos. What I mean by that is if I were to host a community for, Canadian banks, and people exploring a career in banking, and I did not have at least a couple of those logos that in Canada of the big banks, you would think, okay, maybe like a lower impact. Maybe I had a really high attendance rate to my conference, but I didn't have the big logos of the people that are representing the most influential organizations in banking. And so that's one example of impact. The other thing that people measure on impact is like net promoter score. And there's a bunch of problems with that metric too, but at least it ultimately says, if this community were to disappear tomorrow, how much worse would you as a community member, how much worse would your life be? And for some communities, it's like, this community is everything to me. It's the only place I can learn. It's the only place I can, meet others that are walking the same path as me. I can be open with this community, or I find value. Like I find economic value, like I find jobs through this community, or maybe I find customers through this community, or maybe I just find discounts through this community, right? Or I get really good advice through this community. So the impact is like how strong of a value it is to the people in the community. And those can be a little bit more qualitative. So I think when you look at like a conference, like, and I'll tell you, we are definitely, we're at like a peak level of AI conference at least in the technology ecosystem right now. I should say, I'm not going to call the top, maybe it'll keep climbing, but it feels pretty peak. And so I'd say everyone is having really high engagement scores probably on their attendance in terms of people actually checking in, physically showing up to events. Developer events have lines around the corner, people trying to learn new AI technology. It's pretty inspiring. Impact is something that each community leader is probably measuring on their own in terms of who's actually there, what's the ROI on the event in terms of customer conversion, et cetera. So there's other ways to measure impact.
To your earlier point about like Reddit, and a company that has gone public, been phenomenally successful, and is essentially a collection of like hundreds of thousands of different communities. And to your conversation about the AI conferences, like when you do community really, really well, it can be a competitive moat. It can be a huge differentiator. So if there's entrepreneurs listening today who are kind of thinking about how to build that competitive moat, that think of Michael Porter and his like 5 forces, how do you protect yourself kind of from competition? How can entrepreneurs use community as a tool to build a moat that protect their businesses?
Wow, that's a really good question. I don't know for sure if community is a real moat, but it's certainly an asset. You hear one of the adages you hear a lot in entrepreneurship. This is not just, I really don't want to just speak to the technology ecosystem in entrepreneurship, that go to market or sales or distribution, however you hear that term, is so key to success, right? You have to build a great product, but you have to get it in the hands of users. And so it's a really, I think it goes almost without saying that if you can build a really vibrant community of people engaging with your product in some way, that is an asset. Um, where this gets really interesting, I think, is when the community are users, but not necessarily the customer. And so you see this in technology a lot, or where um, somebody like the chief procurement officer or chief information officer or something is like buying a technology, but you need a bunch of developers to be using it. Um, and so you have sometimes two streams of expertise within the company. You've got one, the marketing and sales organization that is trying to drive sales at the enterprise level. And then you've got community, which sometimes rolls up into marketing, sometimes rolls into sales, sometimes rolls into product. And their goals are to really maximize the developer usage of the software. And they do not have a sales, sometimes a sales goal specifically for people managing that community. They just want to get feedback. They want to be listening to. They want to encourage usage, encourage problem solving, sharing among the community. Like they're just trying to maximize the end practitioner usage, which is very different. So that's like spun an entire new development in the world of community, which is sometimes called DevRel or developer relations. Sometimes it's called developer evangelism, developer advocacy. Where you see this like really in the media. Sometimes it's like Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference, right? That's just for people building apps. Like it's pretty, it's pretty cool. So that's a whole new skill set. And if anyone's like interested in that, there's some pretty great places online to go learn about community in that sense. Actually, I've learned a lot from the DevRel community in terms. I have applied a lot of things that I've learned from DevRel to my own journey building a community.
I think of other companies as well. Somewhat maybe counterintuitively, I actually think of like Costco. I think
Ooh.
Costco has like done a really good job of like fostering a community of people who love Costco. From the free snacks that people go, and just when you're in Costco, it feels different than a lot of other stores. It feels like you're part of the Costco community. Maybe that's because you have to buy a membership as well. And now I think about it, but beyond Costco, like Laura, what are other companies that aren't in tech that you think do a really good job of building community?
Oh my gosh. Okay. That are not in tech. Well, let me take a first stab at. I actually think that there's just a model of community entrepreneurship where it's not the company exists for the community. I would say the community that I built, and I was not the founder of, but I grew it and managed it for a number of years, called the C100. I'd say Venture for Canada is a lot like this too. And then I've seen some really incredible entrepreneurship and people building communities as the organization that they're building. It's not for another company. It exists just for its members. I'm a member of a community called the VC Platform Global Community, for example, and that's a standalone organization. It is run for and by people in non-investing roles. That means like in content or talent or community roles within venture capital. And it's just for us, right? And we learn together. We're connected on a Slack channel. We go to events. We share best practices. And we pay to go to a conference, and they're sponsors of the conference, and that's probably a big part of how like a lot of those organizations make money. But I really think of community, building communities as a pathway to entrepreneurship. People like building Venture for Canada as an entrepreneur. That's really incredible, because then that means the community actually is the organization. The community is the product. It's not just there to serve a company. It's there to serve the members, and that's powerful. So I'm a big believer in communities as a path to entrepreneurship. In terms of like other companies that do this really well, I'm not thinking of any like incredible examples right now that are not technology because I'm so embedded in the technology world. But I will give one that's kind of venture capital-y, which is Y Combinator. Um, I think that Y Combinator wins in the incubator accelerator space for a few reasons, but their community is a huge part of that. Every year when Y Combinator applications open, you see alumni from Y Combinator across the internet offering to volunteer their time to mentor people on their applications and how to get in. They have a very, very bare bones, but functional internal, CRM called Bookface is famous that connects you to every other YC entrepreneur that's ever been through the program. I know this not because I've interacted with it because I've never been through YC, but I hear about this from many of my friends who've done it. And I just think that what they've managed to build in terms of expectation setting, in terms of, rewards, the benefits of being involved in the YC community, is pretty much second to none. Like it's an incredible, incredible community. And people co-invest, people hire from the YC community. They find their first customers in the YC community. It's a really beautiful thing.
I've heard similar comments from different Venture for Canada fellows who've done YC and just their passion for it and the kind of give first approach. And what I mean by that is just like a culture of generosity that exists in a community. And that was one thing I was thinking a little bit of. I feel like that at least the communities I'm a part of that I find I'm the most likely to want to spend time in are ones where there is like a collective culture of generosity, of like helping one another. And it's kind of a built into the like identity of that like organization where if somebody reaches out to me from that community, like I will go above and beyond to help that person from that community because that is the cultural norm and the kind of expectation within the community.
Cultural norm. I think it's worth touching on that. So how do you actually go build a community? These things that you're referring to as cultural norms, they do not just happen. You can't just have like hundreds or thousands, probably even just as few as a dozen people. They will only behave with the rituals and expectations that you have helped set for the community. So those like bylaws or code of conduct or cultural norms in a community are, I think, the same as you'd see, for example, in like a church group, right? Or like there's like if you go to mass or if you've ever been to a mass, there's like a time in the service when they'll say, now pass the peace. And suddenly everyone in the church knows to like turn around to each other and give each other a kiss or shake their hand or whatever is the norm for that community. And they all basically like, greet each other in this really, really nice way. Similarly, like that is because it is a pre-assumed expectation that this happens when we all gather here, right? It's like a ritual to it that you do not expect to happen outside of that community. It's not that everybody, who belongs to that community, then when they're outside of that context and they're at work, they don't go to work and, kiss everybody at work. They kiss people in the church because that's like the time and designated place. That's the norm in their community. And so I think when you take this into other communities, like the communities you've been a part of, crystallizing those expectations is actually really important to scaling a community. So this is something that I dealt with when I was leading the C100, which at the time was about 100 people in San Francisco, and it was designed to be 100 people. And we wanted to open up a new product for membership. And as we were scaling that early version of the C100 membership, and we had people also, it's COVID, like they're moving all over the world, and we got people joining every month now, getting referred in. How do we maintain the culture that seemed normal for the 100 people who kind of all knew each other because they were all co-located in San Francisco, and then actually translate that across time and space, and countries even. And it comes down to actually setting those expectations. And so our answer to that was actually upon onboarding, we would actually walk through like core cultural values of the community, which were, we had like 4 things, and they're unique for every community. But one of them was exactly how to deal with this thing about like be responsive to each other. I think I remember like an expression we'd say is like a no is okay, but a no show is not. And so what we really wanted to make sure was that people could, if they asked a community member for feedback or for a meeting or whatever, they could expect a response. And the response might be no, might be like, I can't do this, or this is not my thing, or whatever. 100% okay. But you should not expect a no response. That would be like kind of against the culture. You want to build, so every community has something like that. And I really believe that it should, like, those rituals should kind of feel really unique to you, almost as weird as that idea of like, I go to church on Sundays and I get a kiss there from my neighbors, and versus I know I'm not going to get a kiss from my neighbors like on my street. It should feel unique to your community. And part of that is building that culture that will scale over geographies and over membership cohorts, right? So as new people join, they learn pretty quickly like what's expected in the environment of this community versus the other one that they might be a member of. So I like that spirit like that. You're saying, like, do the fellows kind of all have a certain thing that's expected of them that they would always recognize in another VFC fellow?
I think that there's that similar kind of expectation to try to help other Venture for Canada fellows. And it's not necessarily a specifically like set in stone, like this is in some ways is like an implicit kind of like cultural norm, but it's interesting to think about setting those in perhaps like a more like explicit way.
I was going to say the explicit thing, that's just one way to do it. The other way to make it explicit is actually to reward it. You can reward it privately or reward it publicly. But let's say someone in the community creates a template for others or says, hey, I'm going to share something in public that I just went through, and I thought others might find it helpful. Or they just go out of their way to do something really kind for a member. If that's just like a nice thing that happened, that actually is not a community norm yet, right? Because you're like, wait, we've got good behavior here. How do we reward the good behavior so that more community members take that same action next time? And it becomes a thing that our community just does for each other. And that's where you get into rewards. And by rewards, that can be like a private phone call from Scott saying, hey, I heard you really helped another fellow. I just want you to know that went noticed, and that totally is the culture we're trying to build here. Thanks so much. Okay, so that's like a private reward. The public reward is like, when people start, if people are willing to like host a bunch of office hours or they take actions towards being really, really helpful, somehow they get a new title, which is like, I'm like the Calgary chapter captain, or I get to host an event next time, or I get to be a speaker, or maybe I just get like a badge that says like super user or like super community member. And so those are rewards that actually help you like reinforce the really good behavior and make it a norm. Because this stuff, if it's random, that's beautiful. But if you reward it and if you state out at the outset that like, hey, this is what we want to see and it's part of what it means to be in this community, that's when you actually get to like building more of what I would call like a functioning community business almost.
Yeah. And I agree. It's in some ways the most like impactful cultures are the ones where you don't need to have like a 10 commandments of like, this is how you behave. Like to your point,
Right.
that they are somewhat more implicit, and the norms are created through that public or private kind of rewarding and all of the little behaviors that can take place within like a given community. One thing that I also think about a little bit is the importance of like rituals in a community, which we've talked about before. And I think of even in the context of Venture for Canada, with our alumni community, we do an annual alumni summit. We have a bunch of different like VFC traditions that have kind of taken place. Or I think about there's a fellowship I did called Action Canada, and whenever there's a speaker who comes to speak, every single person for like 20 years has said, at Action Canada, we have a tradition to think. And there's like this whole thing about like that every single person in Action Canada says whenever they introduce like a speaker.
I love that.
And everyone smiles and immediately knows like, oh, okay, it's the Action Canada tradition. How can somebody like a community leader or somebody who works in community build those kinds of traditions that create this sense of belonging, but also kind of a pattern of like repeatable processes that kind of keep that community alive and engaged over time?
It's really, this is so important. And this, any great like people leader, whether you're running a community or not, you might be running a company, right? Will tell you rituals and rewards actually are like, they're really important for building a culture. But back to those of us like running communities, rituals should be unique to your community's mission and purpose, and to your brand. And so the community ritual at Action Canada, right, might make perfect sense for that community, but be kind of out of place in another one. And so I think that this is really comes back to like, what's the mission of your community? Make it stand out. Your members really should just know what connects them. And any rituals that you build in should kind of tie back to reinforcing what the purpose of that community is. And so when I think about examples of rituals, right? It might be special way that you kick off meetings. It might be a special way that you celebrate top contributing members. Or it could be really quirky, like the thing you just said, right? Or maybe the onboarding process is really funny and you have to like, take some sort of like oath. There's like lots of ways to do this. But I think that whatever it is, it should be really unique to you and your purpose. At the C100, which is an example, I should draw upon some others because I've been a part of a lot of really incredible communities in my career. But that one is particular because we cultivate global Canadians, particularly those that were in positions of influence in the technology ecosystem. And I had a big unlock one day when I was hosting an event, and I don't remember where in the world this event was, but it became a really repeatable theme for me, which was that you introduce who you are, what you're building, and just say what your favorite Canadian memory is. And I'll tell you, this ritual, which sounds really normal to Canadians, would not work in Canada as well. Everyone's in Canada. So your favorite Canadian memory is like, geez, it's like my whole life, right? But when you're a Canadian who's living abroad, you start to get very nostalgic for Canada. And asking this question among expats, especially business leaders, suddenly you get like the tears, you get the laughs, and you get people reminded of why they're all together, which in our case was, hey, you're part of this really interesting and esoteric group, which is Canadians abroad who work in technology. And we want to do stuff that's going to have a great impact back home on the technology entrepreneurs at home. And so asking them what your favorite Canadian memory was became like an amazing way to get people together. And then for, I think like 2 or 3 years after that, like that was a question I asked at every single C100 gathering outside of Canada. When I was hosting events in Canada, it'd be a little different, but outside of Canada. And I remember I'll tell you, this is like just a little anecdote. You'll have like so-and-so general partner at XYZ really important fund, so-and-so CEO of ABC, really cool startup, whatever. And you know what they're all talking about at the end of the day when they talk about favorite Canadian memories? It's all the stuff that we romanticize in Canada, which would be like talking about the snow. Like, especially this came up. I held a dinner like this in Dubai, and all these Canadians in the Middle East, and they like all talk about missing the snow. So the snow, beaver tails, like that kind of thing comes up. But really, people's immigration stories also come up a lot. People remember like when they first became Canadian, or when they landed, or when their family landed, and those stories become really cherished. And so that I tell you that anecdote just because like that story, like I don't use that in my current context. I run community for venture capital fund, and people are from all over the world. And they have different things in common, which are more that they're building technology companies or whatever. But for our community, for our purpose, and for the culture of our community, creating that ritual really connected people and reminded them of what their common purpose was. And so I think it's cool that you had that at Action Canada. Every community should do this differently.
I love those examples from the C100 about that kind of connection to Canada. I relate. I definitely felt much more Canadian when I lived in the US for 5 years, and it made me a lot more patriotic. And it's funny, after being now living in Canada for 10 years straight, I still feel very Canadian, but like my vantage point is very much like only being in the Canadian context.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to your point too about like for that, it's such a brilliant idea for C100 where you're engaging Canadian expats around the world to think about, to use that as kind of a ritual, for
ritual.
people to open.
Yeah.
One kind of more closing question is, I think an important part of a community is both celebrating the good things, but also like in some instances, I don't know, in any community, there can be transgressive like behavior that ends up happening where people violate the norms of the community. And that can often be like a make or break for the community that based on how that community kind of responds. It can cause divisions based on how the leader of the community works, or the manager of the community. So I guess the question to you, Laura, is beyond the celebrating what's good. What advice do you have for community leaders on how to also deal with transgressive behavior within a community?
Okay. First things first. Do people even know what transgressive is? Do they know what the rules are? Right? That's on you as a community leader. So if you're a community entrepreneur and your community even has 5 members and it's people in, Kenora, Ontario wanting to, young people in Kenora, Ontario wanting to start companies, for example, and you create a community just around that and you meet every week in a coffee shop. Let's say that's a community, right? Does that community know what the rules are? Do they know that it's actually against the community rules to invite your buddy who doesn't belong to that, doesn't have that same thing in common, that maybe is like a banker or something, whatever. Do they know that? Well, if the answer is no, then it needs to be actually stated up front. So I think the first step to this of dealing with like misbehavior in any community is like making sure that people know what the code of conduct is. And so that to me solves, basically that does like 80% of the work for you. The truth is most community leaders will not have one until someone transgresses and you're like, oh, we probably need a rule for that. We probably need like a process for that. And now I'm putting aside things that are like totally egregious, that are like not generally acceptable in business culture or in the culture at large. Like if someone's like really mean or aggressive to a member or something, that needs to be dealt with. But there is there are a lot of things that just aren't allowed and don't feel right for certain communities, just because it's not what the community is for. So the first step, I think, is making sure that your members know the rules really well. The second, I'd say, like, don't be afraid to put up a gate. And when I say put up a gate, this means sometimes this transgression is just because certain people don't belong in your community. I have a friend who, recently tried to sign up for a community that's for HR professionals, and he's technically not an HR professional, but he really likes people leadership. And they said, "Hey, sorry, like the community is just for HR professionals. Like you can't be a member here, but we wish you all the best." And because we're both in the community space, like he turned to me and he's like, "That's so nice. Like I'm not offended at all. They just made it super clear that that's like not like that's not what the community is for." So I think putting up a gate is really important. It's actually in service to the membership experience. There's an expression I often think that like if a community is for everyone, then it's actually for no one, right? There needs to be a common purpose and thread for what brings people together. And if the members, if people don't meet those criteria, whether it's even just like, do you happen to be, Canadian in in tech or something. If you're not Canadian or you're not in tech, like it just doesn't make sense. And so that's in service. And then the other thing is like actually dealing with bad behavior. And so my rule of thumb is always praise publicly, criticize privately. And so I have been known to privately message community members saying, "Hey, you, um, let me give you some feedback." Nobody likes doing this, right? You don't want to. Nobody likes doing this, and so you want to make sure that whatever it is you're giving feedback on is actually really important and critical to the community. But yeah, it's on you to protect your membership experience like that.
Community is something that is so important both for individual like well-being, but also I think for like organizational like success and like long-term vitality.
Yeah.
Laura, I think you've shared a ton of great insights on this interview today. Is there anything that you wanted to add that you didn't cover?
Yeah. There's one thing. I was thinking about like how you actually start a community. So I'm a really big believer that community is a path to entrepreneurship. And I know that our Venture for Canada community is all really, they're really all looking to Venture for Canada to help them create an entrepreneurial career path. And I actually think that starting a community is an amazing way to do that. I have seen people bolster an incredible network for themselves just by creating a community that ultimately people find valuable. And so I thought we could talk just a little bit about that. I was thinking, like, what does it actually take to start a community? And then both from what it takes you to start, but then also to kind of manage it. And so I thought it might be helpful if we talk about that. But the first thing I wanted to say is just start small and be a connector within your group. And so that means like if you are, at university and you're particularly interested in finding, a job at an entrepreneurial venture, maybe it's starting a community around you of people also looking to do the same thing. Or if you are, a minority group within an industry that where you feel underrepresented, maybe you find, and you just want some help navigating that, maybe start a community for that. Or you're trying to learn a new skill set and you don't know how to be, or how to do certain things like how to code or whatever. Start a community of other people who want to learn with you. You do not have to be an expert at anything to start a community. You just have to find other people who are like you and be the connector to bring them together. So that's something I'm a big believer in. And if you're the convener, I have observed in communities over my career that the convener is actually where a lot of the value tends to accrue over time. Of course, individual community members get tons of value, but if you're the convener, that makes you an entrepreneur in the space. And then one way, the last thing is around the content. So especially if you're part of like a learning community, or, career progression community, like a lot of communities are, the content curator plays such a role in advancing the learning of members, but also in bringing really like dynamic luminaries, like speakers, people who have like a magnetic effect on a community. If you can be the content curator, which is like, okay, I read all these blog posts this week, and the most interesting one was X, or I, have watched every YouTube video out there on how to do Y. And I'm going to create my own how-to video that's better than the rest of them. That's actually curating content. So again, you don't have to be the expert. You just have to like help all the members of your community actually distill it into the important things. That also can have a really strong convening power. And so I think like I would encourage anybody listening, anybody who wants to do, take an entrepreneurial path, to think about that. One community leader I know has a great expression, and I'll quote him here. Lloyd Lobo. He's an author, an entrepreneur. He's a Canadian as well, living abroad right now. And he says, if you build a community, you won't become a commodity. And I think that that's super true. And I've seen that pay off hugely for people in the path to entrepreneurship. Um, but what it ultimately comes down to is that uh, you're the one giving, right? By using your convening power, your content curation, and your connecting power. Uh, that's like one side of it. The other side is actually, how do you manage it? And I have thought a lot about this over the years of like, what is the stack? Like, what's the stack of tools that people actually need in order to keep a community going? You do need some sort of infrastructure, like some sort of place where community members convene, or where you keep track of them. I should say where you keep track of them, like a list of members, or it's a Slack channel or whatever, or a WhatsApp group. I've seen lots of really cool communities on WhatsApp. And then you need some sort of product or content that they gather around, whether that's an event, certain content, or even special products like a book club, for example, is around that. And then you need moderation, and there's lots of tools to help you with moderation around surveys and communication, like tools like an email distribution channel, or a Slack and Discord community. But that's really, there's really like three layers to this, and they can be super, super basic or super sophisticated depending on the community. But it all comes down, I think, to like just finding a mission, finding the people that are like you, and bringing them together. And there's some great resources out there I want to point people to on this as well. It's a great book called The Business of Belonging by David Spinks. He's an awesome community entrepreneur. There's another great book called The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker that I really recommend. And I just say, hey, get moving, and don't just get moving. Just start a community and start bringing people together. You never know where it will end.
Community can be both a competitive moat for a company, but it can also be a huge differentiator for like a person in their career. I think the role, like I reflected my own life in the last 10 years building Venture for Canada, and I've reaped a lot of personal and professional benefits from fostering community. And I think of actually someone I was just speaking with this morning, who's a lawyer at Sykes and Elliott. His name is Mario Negro. He's going to be a lawyer, or he's going to be a guest on the podcast. And he's fostered this entrepreneurship through acquisition search fund community. He's a lawyer, but he hosts events all across Canada that involve like hundreds of people. And he is just a super engaging person.
Yeah.
And as he talks about it, at the core, what it is, it's about helping people.
Yes.
It's when you have that give first mentality. And I think of Adam Grant and that give and take. Like when I met Mario and I was speaking with him this morning, I just was like, this guy's just such an innate giver. Like he just is very much somebody who just is
that's very
generous.
That's an amazing example. That's such a good example. I actually had the pleasure yesterday of meeting somebody who's just like that. He runs a community called 2 Minute Papers. He's a researcher, PhD researcher in AI, and he summarizes papers in 2 minutes on YouTube, and incredible following. But you think about like the speed to learning that convening people has, like it's amazing. Yeah, I love that example. There's I'm going to leave you with something I remind myself. It's actually written like on my notebook. I think about it a lot. That community is a lot like interest. It compounds and creates abundance with time and consistency. And so that example that you just gave to me is like, this guy is putting pennies in the Goodwill piggy bank, the karma piggy bank, by giving. And ultimately, he's creating so much prosperity for the people in the community. I believe one day that will either pay back to him in goodwill or even just like life satisfaction. But the truth is, it'll probably pay back for him in business too. I mean, it's really amazing path to entrepreneurship.
I completely agree. And I think so many like the different entrepreneurial leaders who I admire the most are the ones who are like very community centric to different ways. I think Janet Bannister, who you know well, and who's been a guest on the podcast.
Yeah.
To me, she she doesn't have like a formal community role per se, like in the sense, but I think she is somebody in like the Toronto like tech community is like a pillar type person who I was just actually coincidentally speaking with her yesterday
Ah,
about something, and she just comes to mind as somebody super generous. Anyway, I'd to say any community is built by many of these people who go above and beyond. And I think in the words of Adam Grant, I think he uses the word like super connectors, or maybe that's from another book. But these people who kind of are this like glue. And if you were to kind of like map this ecosystem of social connections, they're the person who is often, 5xing from helping people in an efficient way. And that's one thing Adam Grant talks a lot about is that there's only so many hours in the day. The most
right.
effective givers find really efficient ways to help people so that they can increase the number of people that they help highly effectively.
Well, and that actually, building a community is a force multiplier for that. So if you find that you are somebody who's like helping people one on one a lot, and you realize like, I can't do this like constantly for every single person. What if you created a community where you all came together to help each other at a given time? And then you almost kind of graduate out of the one-to-one helper and create a many-to-many helper community around you, so that they can help one another. That is a force multiplier.
Agreed. Laura, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing all of your different experiences with the community. I think this is a really important episode for entrepreneurs, or also for people starting their career, to think about how can you be a community builder. Anyone can be a community builder.
Yep.
And being a community builder can be a differentiator for you as an entrepreneur.
Yep.
And a huge competitive advantage that both helps you, but also helps a lot of other people. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Thanks for listening to this episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and through our email list. And be sure to subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss our next episode. Have feedback on today's episode? Let us know directly in the app. Thanks again for listening and for joining the new wave of entrepreneurs. Till next time.